The title of our collective churches today is Stand with Reverence. And I love that our theme of the winter workshop this year gets to be to stand in awe. And like Preston said yesterday, you really cannot talk about awe and not talk about reverence. And so the title of my church today is The Root of Reverence. Let's go to Exodus chapter 20. In Exodus chapter 20, verse 18, it says here, when the people saw the thunder and the lightning and heard the trumpet and saw the mountain in smoke, they trembled with fear. They stayed at a distance and said to Moses, "Speak to us yourself, and we will listen. But do not have God speak to us, or we will die." Moses said to his people, "Do not be afraid. God has come to test you, so that the fear of God will be with you to keep you from sinning." The people remained at a distance while Moses approached the thick darkness where God was. You know, at this point, Israel had just been delivered from Egypt after 400 years of slavery. And at this point, they had seen the power and the miracles of God. They had crossed the Red Sea. They had seen Pharaoh's army fall. They had eaten manna that literally fell from heaven. And now they stand on Mount Sinai. And this moment matters a lot because God was not just talking to any strangers, he was talking to his people. He's revealing himself to his people. You know, the Israelites had already seen God. They had seen his hand in their own lives and on how God had rescued them. But God still chooses to show himself this way. And I think so often we're more familiar with the things that God does in our lives than we are with God himself. Sometimes we can get a little bit comfortable in the things that God has blessed us with. And that we get to a point where we slowly start forgetting about God. We start chasing the miracles more than we chase the maker. Have you gotten a little comfortable? You know, God noticed that the Israelites had gotten a little comfortable, and so he did something really strange to really wake them up a little bit. You know, they're on Mount Sinai, God descends, and the scene here is just overwhelming. I mean, I want you guys to just imagine this. There is thunder, there is lightning, there's thick clouds, there's a loud trumpet blasting, the mountain is shaking, and the people start getting trembled in fear. You know, God will always find a way to get your attention. You know, out of all the ways God chose to show himself to the Israelites, he chose to descend and show himself on Mount Sinai with thunder and lightning and mountains shaking. Why? Maybe that's what the Israelites needed to truly see God. You know, maybe the miracles wasn't enough for them. Maybe the things that God had done to save them from captivity wasn't enough for them. And so God did something to get their attention. You know, what does God have to do to get your attention this year? At what lengths do you want God to go to get your attention? You know, recently we studied the Bible with a really great brother. His name is Kyle in Bozeman. And, you know, Kyle is awesome. He was reached out to by our brother Noah. And around the time he was reached out to, he worked at U-Haul. And he had just had a pretty terrible accident where this huge weight dropped on his fingers and literally cut his fingers into half. his fingers, they literally had to be taken to the hospital. They were off of his finger. And they had to be taken all the way to the hospital so that they can reattach them to his fingers. It was the craziest thing I've ever heard. And so, right around that time, that's when Noah reached out to Kyle. And so Kyle started studying the Bible right after he had just gone through surgery. And he said something in his Bible studies that I will never forget. He said that if this accident had never happened to me, I don't know if I would be seeking God right now. Kyle was working 80 hours a week while being a full-time student. God had to do something to get his attention. You know, sometimes God just has to disrupt your life to get your attention. Kyle studied the Bible within 2 weeks, and Kyle got baptized in the kingdom of God. But we really get to see on how the Israelites responded when God got their attention. You know, it says that they trembled with fear and that they stayed at a distance. They turned to Moses and they're like, you speak to God. Because if we do, we're going to die. And then Moses is the one who actually steps up and goes into the thick darkness where God was. Then Moses tells here that tells the Israelites something pretty profound. In verse 20, he's like, do not be afraid. God has come to test you so that the fear of God will be with you to keep you from sinning. You know, Moses says something here that at first when you read it, it can kind of seem a little bit contradictory because it's like, do not be afraid, but fear God. It's like, do not be afraid, but you still got to fear God so that you can stop sinning. Yeah. And Moses here makes a pretty important difference between the two different types of fears. The first, there is a fear that we have that makes us run away from God. And there is a fear that we have that makes us run closer to God. You know, the Israelites, when they saw God in his holiness, in his awe, in his power, they were terrified. They ran away from God and didn't want to speak to God. This is the fear Israel was experiencing. It was the fear of punishment, the fear of destruction, the fear that often creates distance from us and God. And if I was to be honest with you guys, fear was probably one of the biggest sins that I struggled with last year. You know, so often when we're put in a position we've never been in before, it's so easy to operate from a place of fear. But that is the very same reason God showed himself to the Israelites, to remind them that he was with them every step of the way. What meant to be a reassurance of God's presence, in their eyes, it became a reason to retreat rather than draw closer to God. And today I want to remind you, especially as we start the new year, that God is with you every step of the way. That his presence is there to lead you, to guide you, to pull you closer to him and not away from him. You know, I love that it goes on to say that God had come to test them. You know, God did not test Israel to see what he already didn't know. He tested them so that they could see what was truly in their hearts. God already knew their weaknesses. God already knew their fear. The test was not for God's knowledge, it was for their own transformation. You know, the Hebrew word of test often means to prove, to refine, or to reveal something. You know, Israel had just been freed from slavery, but really slavery was still in them. When confronted with God's holiness, they chose distance over devotion. So often we know that God has given us freedom in our salvation, but we don't act like it. We don't act like God has truly given us freedom. We actually don't live in the freedom that God has given us. If you're a disciple of Jesus Christ, you better act like it. If God has saved you, you better act like it. We need to be more secure in our salvation. This test of the Israelites really exposed an important question. Would the Israelites fear God in reverence, or would they fear God in terror? And that's when Moses comes in and makes God's purpose very clear. He's like, so that the fear of God will be with you to keep you from sinning. This fear of God in the Greek is phobos, which means to be in awe, to have a deep respect, and to be aware of God's holiness. This is not the fear that runs away from God. This is the fear that stands firm. This fear is reverence. This is the fear that doesn't make you hide. This is the fear that when you fall short of God's glory, you know how to run back to God instead of running away from Him. This is the fear God places in front of you in your decisions, in your desires, in your daily life. Reverence is knowing that God is holy and you choose to stay close to Him anyways. To know that God is so set apart from who we are, but you still choose to be close to God because you want to be like God. That you want to glorify God. But Moses gets to explain why this fear is pretty important. He says to keep us from sinning. Moses here shows us that there is a direct correlation between our reverence and our obedience. When reverence is the root, obedience will always be the fruit. What you fear the most, you will always obey the most. So if you truly have a reverent heart before God, you will obey God. God wanted to root reverence in their hearts before temptation ever arrived in their lives. Reverence is preventative. It helps us not to have room in our hearts to entertain sin. Reverence guards our hearts from entertaining anything that is not from God. But we know how this ends for the Israelites, because surely in Exodus 32, the Israelites make their own God and they start worshiping their own gods. The Israelites had freedom, but they weren't obedient. Just because you're saved doesn't make you obedient. Freedom doesn't guarantee obedience, reverence does. And so we really got to learn to operate from a place of reverence in our relationship with God. To understand that, yes, God has given us freedom, but it really does start with reverence. Some of us, we struggle with sins that we've struggled with for a long time. And the solution really starts with having a deep reverence that leads us closer to God. Where the fear of God is present, sin will always lose its power. Sin will always lose its power. Those Israelites had freedom, but they wanted their own kind of freedom. And it's very interesting to see the lengths we will go out to disobey God just so that we can feel free. The fear of God, it's not a prison, it's protection. It protects us from entertaining anything that is not from God. Let's close that in Proverbs 16. In Proverbs 16 in verse 6, Proverbs 16 verse 6, it says, through love and faithfulness, sin is atoned for. Through the fear of the Lord, evil is avoided. You know, the verse doesn't say that through the fear of consequences or through the fear of people or through the fear of failure, but only through the fear of the Lord, evil is avoided. You know, when reverence is the root in our relationship with God, obedience will always be the fruit. Holiness will always be something you desire. Sin will start losing its appeal in your life. Why? Because you simply revere God. You know, the Bible says that the people stood far off while Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was. This was the same God. Same holiness, but different response. One group backed away from God, and only one man stepped forward. Why? Because Moses understood something that the rest didn't. That being reverent towards God, it's not a barrier to our intimacy with God, it's the foundation of it. Reverence is the foundation of our relationship with God. So the question is, are you going to be that one man this year? And so let us go after making reverence the root of our relationship with God. I love you guys, and to God be all the glory.